So for your skeleton, we have two main subdivisions of the entire skeletal system. You have your axial skeleton, your skull and your facial bones, your vertebral column over here, and your rib cage, right? Your thoracic cage right here, including your sternum. So that's your axial skeleton. And then you have your appendicular skeleton, which is all the other ones, basically your limbs, as well as the pieces, the bones that kind of hold them in place right there, right? So that's your appendicular skeleton. For your axial skeleton, right, I'm going to go over now just the bones of the axial skeleton right here. So your head, right, is going to consist of your, what they're calling here the neurocranium. We usually just call these the cranium bones, right, that are going to be housing your brain basically in here. So that's your neurocranium, and then the other bones of your skull are your facial bones over here, right? And these will be the bones of your face. So that's your head. And then your vertebral column, which will consist of 5 different regions with various individual vertebrae within that vertebral column over here, which we'll go over. And then again, your thoracic cage over here, which will house the lungs, as well as the heart right over here, right? Your thoracic cage, and then it'll be bounded by that, your diaphragm down here, right? So all this is providing protection for those soft organs of your thoracic cavity up here, as well as providing muscle attachment points. So the brain, your skull is holding your brain, your vertebral column. I already mentioned this, but it's housing basically your spinal cord running down there, and the spinal nerves are running out the side right there. So those are basic functions of your axial skeleton right there. All right, so what we're going to do now is go over the individual bones of your axial skeleton and then your appendicular skeleton, and then we're going to move into a couple more of the good examples of all the features that you guys got to know. All right, so again, your neurocranium, which is holding your skull, is going to consist of all these bones here that are fused together by these sutures right here, right? So going from the back, one easy way to remember this is the mnemonic old people from Texas eat, because it's all the way inside here, this ethmoid bone. So old people from Texas eat ethmoid, and then spiders for sphenoid right here, right? So old people from Texas eat spiders is how you might remember the names for those bones right there, right? So your occipital bone, most posterior one, your paired parietal bones, your singular frontal bone, paired parietal bones, and then your, wait, was that it? Oh yeah, I started there. And these ones that are inside, which we'll see more when we open up the skull or look at different views. because these are the ethmoid. These are part of your skull bone, your cranium. And then for your facial bones right here, there's another mnemonic which you can remember, and it is Virgil can, or inferior nasal concha. Virgil cannot make my pet zebra laugh, so V for Vomer, can for concha for can not, and then nasal. Nasal bones cannot, not for maxilla, make my mandible pet for palatine. Zebra, zygomatic, and then laugh. L for laugh, lacrimal. So Virgil can not make my pet zebra laugh. So is the facial bones. All right, so that's the easy part about remembering the actual bones of the skeleton. And then your vertebral column right here, you're going to have cervical vertebrae. Over here, you don't have to know the individual ones with the exception of C1 and C2 up here. They're the named ones. Your atlas and your axis. The rest are just cervical vertebrae, and we'll see how you're going to identify those. And then you have your thoracic vertebrae, right, that are going to have the ribs attached to them right here. And once you're down below where the ribs are attached, you start the lumbar vertebrae. And again, you won't have to know like L2 from L3 or anything. And then you have your sacrum, which is a bunch of fused vertebrae, and the coccyx down. And so that's your vertebrae, the individual vertebrae, the bones that you'd have to know. And then you have the rib cage, which will consist of the 12 ribs and the sternum. So the rib cage doesn't take much, so I'll just go over this in detail, and this is all really you got to know about the rib cage. The rib cage has your, it's called your breastplate or your sternum right there, which actually has the 3 bones to it, the manubrium, the body, and the xiphoid process right here. And then you have the ribs, which are attached to it, or at least 7 of them are, right? So these 7, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 are called true ribs because they're directly attached to the sternum. And then these other ones down over here, which aren't directly attached, are 8, 9, 10, and then these floating ribs back here, 11 and 12 are called false ribs, right? And then of the false ribs, these last 2 ribs are not attached to the sternum at all, so they're called floating ribs. So that's really all you got to know about the rib cage and elements. And so all those are the bones of your axial skeleton. And then I'll just go over very briefly here the bones of your appendicular skeleton before we move into the features of the axial skeleton. All right, so when you look at the skeleton right here, right, remember if you're a kid, if you have kids, if you've ever seen drawings, your skeleton looks something like this. And so in this case, here's your axial skeleton, and then these are your appendicular skeleton over here. But you'll notice the arms, your limbs are not coming directly off your axial skeleton, hopefully. So by the time you're done with this class, when you see your kid drawing something like that, you could say, duh, you forgot all these other parts right here, right? So your whole limbs are going to be attached by what's called this pectoral girdle up here. So these are going to be providing the attachment points for your limbs to the axial skeleton. And so here's your sternum over here. And this serves as the really only attachment point from the axial skeleton out to your upper limbs right here. So it's going to start with the clavicle over here, which is going to connect really briefly, with the joint. And these are all going to be fused together with these ligaments. It's going to be connected to the shoulder blade, which you'll know as the scapula now, right? So that's your collarbone, your shoulder blade. Over here, that's the scapula, which attaches the large singular bone, your humerus, which is going to connect down here with these two smaller bones to form your forearm here at the elbow joint, your ulnar, and your radius over here, right? So your ulnar is the more medial one. Remember, we're always in anatomical position. So it goes down towards your pinky. And then your radius is on the lateral side going down towards your thumb side. And then you have this connects the wrist here, the wrist joint right here, to your hand over here, which is going to consist of the carpal bones. There's 8 carpal bones. And then you have the metacarpals over here that are directly attached to the carpal bones. These will be basically the palm of your hand is going to be something like that. Whereas your knuckles are going to be like right here, right? Just for your own perspective, if you make a fist right now, you can kind of get a feeling that right here, these are the metacarpals. These are making up your knuckles, right? And then after those, you are going to have the phalanges over here, right? These are your fingers or your digits, right? Your digits, you can call them your digits, but each digit is going to be made up of either 2 or 3 phalanges. Right over here. Right, so we'll get into the naming of those. Well, actually, we can go right now because it's pretty quick. Right, each metacarpal is going to be named logically. Metacarpal 1 is your thumb, metacarpal 2, 3, 4, and 5. Right, and so this is digit 1, digit 2, digit 3, digit 4, digit 5. Each digit is going to be made up by those phalanx. Each individual one is a phalanx. So the phalanges right here. And you have a proximal, the one closest to your shoulder or wrist, the middle, and the distal. Okay? So they're logically named. So even though it's a lot of bones in there, it's not. These are pretty easy once you learn the pattern right there. Okay? And then the carpals we'll get into next week, the actual naming, how we're going to remember those. All right, so that's your upper limb, right? Your pectoral girdle with your collarbone, your scapula, your clavicle, your scapula, and those 3 upper limb bones, and all your hand bones. So similarly, you're going to have, instead of a pectoral girdle, you're going to have a pelvic girdle, which is going to be attached to your sacrum, right over here on both sides by these 2 hip bones. This is going to be made up of 3 regions or fused bones right there, which we'll get into later. And that provides the attachment point. This is your attachment point for your femur, which is the kind of equivalent of your upper limb's humerus, right? Because you can see it's attached to the hip joint, that's attached to the shoulder. Then you have, instead of a elbow, you have the knee joint, which is going to be articulating with these 2 lower bones, more distal bones, your tibia on the medial side, and then the smaller fibula on the lateral side. And so then those are going to be making up the ankle joint. And for your foot, instead of carpals, you're going to have these 7 tarsal bones. And then they're going to be articulating with these metatarsals instead of the metacarpals. In this case, the first one is your big toe. It's the more medial one. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then just like your hand, you're going to have the phalanges, right? The phalanx. And you're going to, again, you're going to have a proximal and a distal for your big toe. And then all the other ones are going to have the three: proximal, middle, and distal phalanx of those digits. That's the only hard part, is learning these tarsal and carpal bones. So that's it. That's all the bones that you have to know, right? And so now let's get into a little bit more into the details about what we'll see as the features. Any view you're looking at for the skull right here, you can look at the frontal view, you can look at the side view. We're going to be looking at inside the skull too, and look at all these features inside right here, right? So for the skull, what we have here are a lot of holes going through, and what those holes do is provide a passageway for nerves as well as blood vessels that are running into and out of the skull, into the brain, like into the facial area. Right, so all these holes have distinct meanings right there. So this is why we're having you learn all of them, because they're important. So those are some of the major things that we're going to run across right here. And then the other part of it will be just landmarks, or what are called things like muscle attachment points, things like these processes right here. That'll be more relevant to the appendicular when we get to it. So let's get into the details here. For your skull here, looking from this anterior view, for instance, you have things like this little hole right here, this hole right here, there's a hole right over here, and then there's maybe one or two, right? So these are besides the actual bones that we're looking at, like these inferior nasal concha, or your vomer or something. We have all these features. Remember all those terminology you have to remember, right? The orbit is where the eyeball is. Supra means above, infra means below, right? So you have this supraorbital foramen, and if you see the word foramen, it usually means a passageway for which blood vessels and nerves are coming through. So you have this supraorbital foramen right here, right? You got nerves, you got blood vessels running through them. So it's the supraorbital foramen. And then right underneath the eyeball right here, you have an infraorbital foramen. So those are two holes that you would have to identify. And then down here, you also have what's called the mental foramen. Another one where nerves would be coming out, right? Or in. So there's just a couple of the features. And then on each individual bone, you might have to identify not so many on the outside skull, but like say on your jawbone, you have this projection here that's going to form the articulation surface with your temporal bone right here, called the condylar process. Down over here, you have this shark fin looking thing here called the coronoid process. Right over here for the jawbone. And then for the skull, they're joined together by these lines right here. Right? These are where you have these tight, interlocking, ossified, fibrous connections in between there. Right? Because when you're a fetus and when you're a kid, right, these are going to be allowing the skull to grow, right, and expand a little bit. And then eventually when you're old, they'll ossify and fuse together, almost as if it's a single unit. So you have to know a couple of these, what are called sutures, these connections in between, right? So first one, frontal one right here. Going across, you could think of this as this person wearing a little crown, a little corona. Right? That's the coronal suture connecting the frontal bone and the two parietal bones. Right there. So your frontal bone, and then your left and right parietal bone are joined by that coronal suture. And then your left and right parietal bones are joined by this sagittal suture. Remember, the sagittal plane separates the left and right halves right there. So this sagittal suture is connecting those two parts. And then those left and right parietal bones are connected to the occipital bones through this lambdoidal suture right here. Okay, and one more suture. This one is called the squamous suture over here, and this is, for the most part, connecting your temporal bone here with the parietal bones, and to some extent your occipital bone. So that's your squamous suture. Right. So for your outside features, those are some of the main ones. We also have a couple of complicated structures just from a lateral view right over here for your temporal bone. And you have this outcropping right here of the temporal bone where it joins up with your zygomatic bone. So this part right here, this process is called the zygomatic process because it joins up with the zygomatic bone. And then likewise, this zygomatic bone has this temporal process that joins up with the temporal bone, right? This little region right here is the temporal process of the zygomatic bone, whereas the temporal bone has this zygomatic process. And together, they form what is called feature called the zygomatic arch. So that's that connection over here, this bony part right here. So that's the zygomatic arch. So also externally, a lot of these, again, in the temporal region, you have right here, this little hole right over here. This is where your, what's called the external acoustic meatus, right? Your ear is right over here. This is basically your ear canal going into your skull right there. That's your external acoustic meatus. And then you have a couple other little points. Let's see, we could just isolate this when you want to learn. Not that you have to know this bone. I'm not going to put it by itself. It's going to be fused, but sometimes it's useful to kind of look at some of these parts, right? So you have the mastoid process right over here. This is going to be a major muscle attachment point. You have this little styloid process over here. And then you have that external acoustic meatus over here. If they label this. This is just, they're just labeling this as squamous portion, but again, you have that zygomatic process right over here. So that's your temporal bone from the outside. Here we have the occipital bone, and we have what's called the external occipital protuberance, this midline structure right over here that's on your lab activities list. I think that's the only stuff we got to know on the outside of the skull right there. So the sutures and a couple of those features over here. We're going to go, instead of, I'm going to look at the bottom portion of the skull, but over here to the models. Just go to the head and neck so we can take a good look at the inferior view of the skull. All right, so starting from the anterior part, right over here, you're going to want to be able to recognize the individual bones, right? Like your, right here we have the maxilla over here, which remember, that's marking up part of your facial bones, but it also makes up the 3/4 or so of your top of the roof of your mouth right there, the hard palate. And that articulates with the palatine bone down here, which you can see the inferior surface of this region here called the horizontal plate. And then that joins up. There's a little bit in the middle here where you can see the vomer, right? The inferior portion of the vomer, which is going to form that midline structure in your nose that you could see. And so your palatine bone and that are going to be connected to this major sort of centerpiece, your sphenoid, right over here. And on your sphenoid, this is one of those ones where we're going to have to know a bunch of features on, right? And I'll show it individually as well. So this is what we're looking at from the bottom view right here. So we're looking down, we're looking from the inferior view of this. Then you have these pterygoid processes right here. Then you'll have again a couple of of holes in there, these foramens, which are going to be visible from that view. And so we'll go over those a little more detail if you need later. So here are those pterygoid processes right here. You're going to be able to see from this view, you're going to be able to see these two holes right over here, which are going to be entirely within the sphenoid bone, your foramen ovale, and the foramen spinosum over here. And so those are, when we're talking about the foramens, you want to maybe start from this view, from the inferior view, kind of go from one direction or the other and kind of label all those things that you got to know, right? So within the sphenoid bone, you got those two holes right there. So that's your sphenoid, and then the sphenoid articulates with the temporal bone. And so there's a little space right over here, right? And that is your foramen lacermen, right? So it's formed, this is like formed by your sphenoid and mostly your temporal. Some images show it also as part of the occipital bone. All right, but that's your foramen lacermen, and that's kind of formed by two bones right there, right? Your sphenoid and the temporal. So your temporal bone next is also pretty complex. You got a bunch of stuff on that. And so we'll isolate it for a second just to show you those from this view. Right over here, right over here. It's not labeling in particular, but this indent right here is called the mandibular fossa. This is where your condylar process of the mandible fits in to form the jaw joint. You have this styloid process that you could see. You could also see that from the lateral view. You could also see the mastoid process over here. And so those are some of the major features and stuff of the temporal bone looking from this view right here. And then you also have here, right, foramen lacermen. Again, you're in your temporal bone right over here. You're where your occipital bone and your temporal bone is meeting up right here. You have this little space right here. This is your jugular foramen. Right over here, this is where a jugular vein is going to be exiting the skull right there. And so that's this hole right here, this passageway that are formed by the occipital and the temporal bone is that jugular foramen. So that's your jugular foramen right over here. And then next to that, next to the jugular foramen right here, you have this individual hole right here. And this is your carotid canal. Now, this is where your carotid artery would penetrate the skull. Right over here from the outside, right? So you have your jugular vein leaving the skull here. You have your carotid artery coming in there. And then those are kind of in your temporal bone or formed by the connection between your temporal and the occipital. And for your occipital, you have a couple of features here. These right here are called the occipital condyles. This is where your first cervical vertebrae are going to be connecting to the skull right there, right, articulating with them right there. So that and this big hole right here is the foramen magnum. Big hole is the foramen magnum. That's where your spinal cord enters and becomes the brainstem inside your skull right there. And again, this midline structure is the occipital protuberance right over here. Let's go back here for a minute and then just go to the full body. And then we're going to add in, again, I'm going to show you the nervous system right here. We're going to be looking down into the brain right there and look at all the other features. So we're going to remove the parietal bones. And then we're also going to remove half the brain to kind of just give you an idea of what this is. So what you're looking at here, so here's the spinal cord coming up into the brain, becomes the brainstem, and then you see all these wirings, right? All this wire and the nerves, are bringing in information and putting out information, right, to like the either your facial stuff, bringing all that information to and from the central nervous system in there. So again, let's just start from the most anterior and kind of move backward and look at some of these features right here. So here's your frontal bone, and you'll see, we didn't really see the ethmoid bone, but the ethmoid bone is this little centerpiece here in the front. And for this one, you're going to have to know, this is one of the ones you're going to have to know individually, right? So this is looking down on it here. You have a couple features here, like the cribriform plate, or the little holes in it are called the olfactory foramina. This is where your olfactory nerves are dangling down into. And then you have this little ridge right over here called the crystal galley. So these are all ones you could see from the top portion right here. So that's your frontal bone and the sphenoid bone. And then you get, your ethmoid bone, and then you get to your sphenoid bone. From this view, we're looking down on it like this. Then we have these features like your lesser wings, your greater wings, the sella turcica. Right, so those are the main kind of features. And then we also have a bunch of holes in it. And so these first top two ones right here are called the optic canals. And this is where your optic nerves, bringing in information from your eyeballs, are entering the skull right here. And then the region where they enter over right here, this sort of indent right here, this is where your pituitary gland sits. This is called the sella turcica. Over here, right? So you got your greater wings, your lesser wings up here, your greater wings down here, your optic canals, and your sella turcica over here. And then you also have this big open space right here, this what's called a fissure right over here. Right? This also has a bunch of nerves and blood vessels and stuff and muscles going through. Right, so that's your superior orbital fissure. And so those are your superior orbital fissure, your optic canals, and then kind of buried in here, it's not really actually visible when you're looking straight down because they're kind of buried underneath the lesser wings. But you have these two holes right under the superior orbital fissure on either side right here. Those are your foramen rotundum over here. And then posterior to that, you have these other two holes right here. You got the foramen ovale, and then you have the foramen spinosum. All right, so we saw those from the inferior side as well, right? If you remember. And then we also saw the foramen lacerum, which is formed by your sphenoid and your temporal bone, right? These two halves are making up the foramen lacerum. So those are those features that you want to recognize with the sphenoid bone. And then you get to your temporal bone, there's a couple other things, right? You have this flattened portion called the squamous portion, right below the squamous suture over here. And then you have this kind of ridge right over here where your inner ear, right? Remember, this is your external acoustic meatus over here. Your internal ear structures are going to be housed in this space right here. And then right over here, you have your, what's called your internal acoustic meatus. Meatus means some kind of passageway, right? This is where your auditory nerve is going to enter into this canal and innervate your inner ear structures. So that's your petrous portion, your squamous portion, and then you have also your internal acoustic meatus. So also on the temporal bone right here, right over here, this passageway right coming into the foramen lacerum right here, you can see this little hole right here. That is where your carotid artery comes out over here, right? So if you remember from the other side, well, it's kind of hard to see. I'd have to remove everything. But from the other side, the carotid canal and the jugular foramen were right next to each other. But the canal kind of goes through this area and then comes out on the other side of the petrous portion of the temporal bone. Right, so that's your carotid canal. And that'll be it for the inside for your temporal bone. And then, of course, for your occipital bone, you have that foramen magnum right over here. Right? And so here's your jugular. Over here, again, formed by the occipital and the temporal bone. So those are the major features of the skull and facial bones that you'll want to kind of start looking into all this week. Look over the lab activities. And I want to go over kind of briefly over the vertebral column, just a couple of key features, right? So remember, we have your cervical vertebrae, these first 7 vertebrae, and you'd have to know the axis, which is C2, and your atlas. And so this is where your occipital condyles sit, right? The skull is sitting on this portion of it. The other one real quick. And this is your axis. Right over here, you have a couple of distinct features. This region right here is called the dens, right? It's a modified body, which we'll see what it is. But then it's going to have these other typical vertebral features. Let's look at a little more typical one. Let's just take a random 5th cervical vertebrae. Isolate. So all your vertebrae, whether you're looking at a cervical, a thoracic, or a lumbar vertebrae, you're going to share some common features. For your cervical vertebrae, you have these holes going down the side in all your cervical vertebrae. And those are going to provide these blood vessels right over here with a kind of safe passageway, right? So that when you're getting choked out and your carotid artery is blocked, then your vertebral arteries are going to allow blood to get to the brain. In any case, those what are called transverse foramen are going to be distinct to your cervical vertebrae. So if you see those, you know you're looking at a cervical vertebrae. And so these transverse foramen are in an area, region, or feature called the transverse process. And so let's look at a little more distinct one. Let's go down to your thoracic vertebrae and look at some standard features of your vertebrae. You have your spinous process coming out the middle here. This is the most dorsal things. You could feel this, all those bumps on your back right there. That's what you're feeling when you're feeling those spinous processes. And then on the side, you have the transverse processes. You have 1 and 2 transverse processes right over there, right? So this is looking down on it. This is looking from the side. This is looking from the front. This is looking from the bottom. And so all your vertebrae are going to have something like that, right? Your spinous process, your transverse processes, right? They're all going to have those features. The other features they're going to have are the body, right? That where the bones are going to articulate with one another over there. You'll also have another process over here that is a sort of projection called the superior articulating process. At the tips of them, at the ends of them, you're going to have the joint surface, which is the superior articulating facet, right? So you have a process and a facet. Let's go back for a second to a thoracic vertebrae. Look at those again on this one. So here's your superior articulating process, and then here is your superior articulating facet. On the bottom here, you have the inferior articular facet. over here, right? And I'll show you them joined together, how the bones join together through those facets. You also have, for all bones, the hole going down the middle. This is your vertebral foramen. And this is where your spinal cord is going down the middle, and again, your body. Plus your spinous process, transverse processes, your vertebral foramen, your body. So those are all major features that there's a couple other ones, and we'll get into more detail. I don't want to put too much detail, but what I want to note here is that for this thoracic vertebrae, remember the ribs, they're coming in, they're articulating. These little spots indicate where the ribs join up with them. So those are called the costal facets. And you have a transverse costal facets and a superior and inferior costal facet. So looking at them joined together, you can see how the ribs come in and articulate with them. And then you could also see how they stack up. Let's remove a couple of these. All right, so for that rib, here was that superior articulating facet, and it's joining up with the inferior articulating facet of the rib above it, right? So that's how they're going to join together. And then through the body right here, they would have these intervertebral discs, right, connecting this fibrous cartilaginous pad in between them. So those are some of the major features of your vertebrae. And again, you don't have to know the individual vertebrae from each other, but you'll want to know, I mean, from like T, 9th and 10th thoracic vertebrae, but you do want to know, right? So this one over here is your 12th thoracic vertebrae, and it kind of looks a lot like your first lumbar vertebrae. But so there's distinct features that'll tell you how you're going to distinguish these. Number one, if you're able to see costal facets, then you'll know you're in a thoracic vertebrae because that's the ones with the ribs attached. The other thing is, those are your 12th thoracic vertebrae. See these facets right here? Or even more distinct over here. Notice how they're facing outward at you. Sure do. And when you start to get to your lumbar vertebrae, those facets are going to be facing inward. Right? So if you see that inward facing facets, it's the way they're joined together. There's a little bit more of a tight interlocking between these two upper and lower vertebrae right there. So the lumbar vertebrae, besides the clunky shape, that's another giveaway between how you could tell those apart. So those are some of the key features of your vertebrae right there. And then you have your sacrum, right, which the only feature you got to know really is your sacral foramina, these holes right here. And then you have your coccyx down here. So that is the axial skeleton, the bones and the features. Make sure to check your lab activities for the actual term list that you'll be responsible for. That will be on the practical. All right, so we'll see you next time.